In the Book of Enoch, after the Watchers have been judged and thrown into their holding place, a brand new set of Holy Watchers is introduced, each with their own divine jurisdictions. We have Uriel, Raguel, Raphael, Michael, Remiel, Sarakel, and at the very end of the list sits Gabriel. And he governs the cherubim, paradise, and according to later Enoch traditions, he governs something much stranger, a different category of being, an idea that goes back to the very beginning of civilization.
This part of the investigation began with what appeared to be a translation issue. While comparing Richard Lawrence's first English translation of the Book of Enoch, I noticed a strange discrepancy in a passage describing the angel Gabriel. According to Lawrence, Gabriel is associated with normal divine things like paradise, the cherubim, but then something that he was afraid to translate, or simply didn't know how to translate. But in later editions, Charles chose the word serpents.
Ancient texts are full of serpents. Genesis has a serpent, Mesopotamia has serpents, Egypt has serpents. Nearly every civilization on Earth seems obsessed with them for some reason. The problem really isn't the serpent. The problem is where the serpent appears. Why, out of everything in creation, did you choose serpents to go there? Now, the more I looked into this problem, the less satisfied I became with the idea that we're talking about literal snakes here, because ordinary snakes don't belong in the same sentence as paradise or the cherubim. The text is treating these three things as though they're comparable categories of significance. And if the serpents weren't extremely relevant, then they wouldn't show up in the text at all.
What makes this even more interesting is that the word itself may carry associations that extend beyond the harmless image modern readers immediately imagine when they hear the word serpent. Throughout the ancient world, serpent imagery repeatedly appears in connection with guardianship, hidden knowledge, sacred spaces, divine beings, dragons, chaos creatures, and entities that exist somewhere between the human world and something beyond it.
Now, earlier when we were examining the Nephilim, we encountered a recurring description involving biting, blood consumption, and predatory behavior. In the Ge'ez material surrounding Gabriel, we now find ourselves staring at a mysterious word that later translators are increasingly associating with serpentine beings. Now look, I'll give it to you, maybe those two things are completely unrelated, but well, you should just give me a second, because it's too difficult to overlook the fact that both of these things might be orbiting the same symbolic territory. Now, the word in Ge'ez is Ikasat, and it sits in this semantic field involving serpents, biting, stinging, possibly punishment, possibly heavenly serpent beings, and also possibly perverts, which I wasn't gonna bring up, but I think I need to.
The weirdest scholarly footnote I found is from Signification of the Proper Names Occurring in the Book of Enoch. It says Ikasat may either be a proper name, as Lawrence thought, or it may refer to hell, the place of future punishment. My argument against this is that hell is already accounted for by another angel in the lineup. What began bothering me was not the impossibility that Ikasat meant serpents. It was the possibility that translators had reduced something much stranger into the word serpent. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Enoch, we encounter another category of being whose defining characteristics is not merely their size, but their appetite. The Nephilim consume everything around them. They consume the resources of humanity. They consume animals. They consume people. And most notably, and specifically, they consume blood. The more I compare these two ideas, the more I found myself wondering whether the common denominator was not simply reptiles at all, but rather consumption, feeding, if it was beings that take from humanity physically and spiritually. Now that idea becomes especially interesting when we go back to the idea that Gabriel is not merely associated with Ikasat. He's placed in authority over them, not to wipe them out, but to supervise them or control them. And we're not just talking about the Garden of Eden being full of witty snakes, because remember, Gabriel has just gotten this promotion, and we're generations and generations from the Adam and Eve story. So at this point, I stop asking myself if these two things are connected, and I start wondering whether they have been intentionally separated. Predators, biters, serpents, dragons, knowledge. Ikasat. Now I find myself becoming curious about a figure that most readers simply take for granted in this story. God. Or more specifically, the Lord of the Ages. The being responsible for enforcing the boundaries that seem to define the entire story. It's easy to assume that this is the all-knowing, all-powerful God that we associate with the Bible. And perhaps it is. But let's just see. Again, Enoch refers to this being as the Lord of the Ages, or the Ancient One. I've been told not to say Saturn here, but anyway, back to the text.
Well, for starters, the entire Watcher's crisis appears to unfold for centuries before any heavenly intervention occurs. We have him assigning 200 of his angels to go to Earth to watch us. They leave their post. The world descends into chaos, and somehow this continues long enough for generations of consequences to happen before the ruler of the cosmos decides to pay us any attention. If this being is all-knowing, why was any of it allowed to happen in the first place? If the outcome was inevitable, why create the conditions for it? And if the transmission of forbidden knowledge is such a threat to creation, why wait until after the damage has already spread through the entire earth? The questions become even more difficult when Enoch finally enters the heavenly realm, because what he describes does not resemble this picture of heaven that we're all carrying in our heads.
Enoch describes immense walls of crystal, rivers and streams of fire, blinding brilliance, terrifying beings, thrones surrounded by energies so overwhelming that he struggles to describe them.
And I just want to point out, I want to remind you that Enoch has been walking with the gods for years at this point. And what he's seeing at this point in the story is anomalous, even to him. This heaven is unlike anything that he's ever seen before walking with the gods. And seated at the center of all of that is a figure that is so terrible that even the angels surrounding him seem overwhelmed by his presence. The atmosphere is not loving, it's not welcoming, it's terrifying. And then God condemns the watchers. Now this God explains that human beings were created mortal. We're born, we reproduce, we die. Our existence follows a cycle that belongs to the earth. Now the watchers, however, were created differently. They belong to heaven. The Nephilim inherited both conditions at once. They were born from flesh, yes, but they descended from immortal spirits. They were born earthly, and yet their origin was heavenly. They are neither one thing or the other. This, according to Enoch, is why they became so unstable. In other words, the giants are not merely a race of hybrid beings. They become the origin story of a completely new category of entity. This is one of the reasons that the Watcher's narrative is so important to later Jewish and Christian thought, because the problem isn't solved when the Nephilim die. According to Enoch, their immortal component survives the destruction of their bodies and continues influencing the world long after the original rebellion has ended. What begins as the violation of the boundary between heaven and earth ultimately creates these beings that belong fully to neither. They have no allegiance. But it actually gets worse, because we're forgetting about Noah.
In later Enochic material, Noah is described in language that sounds alarmingly similar to the language used for heavenly beings. When Noah is born, his father Lamech, who again is the grandson of Enoch, is terrified. The child is not normal. His skin is described as luminous. His eyes illuminate the whole house. His appearance is so unusual that Lamech becomes convinced the child is not his and suspects some involvement of the Watchers.
Now, obviously, the traditional explanation is that Noah is completely legitimate, totally human, don't worry about it. The text actually goes to great lengths to reassure us of that. But the fact that the reassurance is even necessary is both hilarious and fascinating, because nobody needs to explain why Bob down the street isn't a Nephilim. No one even questions if Methuselah is a Nephilim. This explanation appears because the resemblance is obvious enough that people inside the story are asking the question. Because remember, they've seen this before. There have been generation after generation of Nephilim born unto the earth at this point, which creates an uncomfortable possibility. The flood narrative is supposedly about eliminating corruption from the earth, and yet the individual that was selected to survive this reset is repeatedly described in terms that make him appear unusual, exceptional, and in some traditions, otherworldly. This may explain why in 1 Enoch, God tells his angels to find the son of Lamech, Noah, and tell him not to build an ark, but to hide, because all the other Nephilim on the earth were about to be killed.
If the Nephilim represent an unsanctioned mixing of heaven and earth, Noah begins to look suspiciously like a sanctioned exception. So the real issue here may not have been the existence of these hybrids, but who controlled them. I'm not saying that Ikasat and a new branch of Nephilim are objectively the same thing hidden in the subtext of the story. I'm pointing out that the timing is strange. We've only just witnessed the destruction of the Nephilim and the imprisonment of the Watchers when, in the next breath, we are introduced to a new heavenly hierarchy and a mysterious category of divine being. Let us not forget that both the Ikasat and the Nephilim occupy a remarkably similar symbolic territory. Both are described using language associated with biting, serpents, predation, oppression, and blood consumption. Whether that connection is meaningful or coincidental is ultimately up for you to decide. What we do know is that the Nephilim problem does not appear to end when the text claims it should. Biblical canon continues to preserve giant clans long after the flood. The Anakim remain. The Rephaim remain. So either subsequent incursions occurred, or the official explanation is missing part of the story.